Hi, this is Chester Wilmot here, and this is the second of the four-part series on the siltation of the lower Bushmans estuary. In this picture we see some pictures of the dune as it's entering Dry Bones Valley. The top right-hand picture shows the height of the dune. It's already overcome the toilets. It is now covering the car park. The bottom one is a bit of interest that the sand that you see on the left-hand side there is level with the eaves of the house on the right, and it will obviously cover the building below that we can see. This is a Google Earth picture of our estuary, and it depicts the west wind as our prevailing wind, which moves sand from west to east until it reaches this man-made barrier. It's interesting that this sand is gaining in height as it moves towards the river, and it is moving forward at about 1 meter a month. So given time, that too will enter the fray into the estuary. The sand at this stage is moving down that spit of sand, which is the seashore, and this is how it happens. That in the winter, when we have our winter storms, it is always west wind driven, and it causes the sea to strike the earth at a slight angle. But it's interesting, when it gets to the mouth, that wave moves parallel with the beach, carrying huge quantities of sand into the river. And that little spur, that happened over in one storm of a day or two, and there were 15,000 cubic meters deposited there. This sand moves across. Some of it carries on towards Dry Bones Valley, as you can see, but a lot of it moves upriver. And I'll show you too how that happens. With the same high tides or the high seas, we get a tidal surge of 30 to 40 centimeters, and that comes into the river in waves or layers. And as you can see from this next picture, you can see the quantity of sand that is being taken along. That water is just a matter of interest, running at about 9-10 meters a second. Sand comes into suspension at between 1.2 and 1.4. Gives you an understanding of how much sand is moved. Since 1990, 400,000 cubic meters of sand has been deposited just in this lower area of our estuary, which works out to about 15,000 cubic meters per annum. And I might say that that would be a small percentage of the total amount of sand that is coming into our river. So we know the sand moves across the river. Some goes up the river, some remains in that dune, and the dune is moving towards Dry Bones Valley. That dune was measured just incidentally at 122,000 cubic meters of sand at the beginning of this year, 2014, and it is going to progress into Dry Bones Valley. And our proposal is that we denude this valley to allow the sand to move through faster, because we know that sand overcoming vegetation slows down, it forms high dunes, and with that, all the devastation of the sides of that valley. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about it. This is what it looked like in 1940. Dry Bones Valley was a clean wind channel, a wind venturi effect, as it were, high-speed wind blowing the sand through towards Middle Beach. The system has changed somewhat by 1955. Eric Harper, one of the first builders of Kenton, used this as a brick site for building blocks on the beach using shell grit, and he had a well dug there, and to protect the wind from blowing into the well, he placed branches on the beach. 1966, it is enlarged dramatically. By 1966, the municipality of the day had built a car park, and to protect the wind blowing onto the car park, they in turn did exactly the same thing by placing branches on the beach. 1990, the situation has changed dramatically. Whole of Dry Bones Valley is now vegetated right up to the mouth. 2003, the dune is now broken loose from its vegetation and has started to move. You can see just a little remaining piece there, just as an interest datum point. That is where the toilet is. 2010, the sand is now truly moving, nothing stopping it. It's now dune height of about 10 meters, toilet still ahead of it. 3 years later, 2013, the toilets have been overcome, and the dune is now without doubt hitting Dry Bones Valley. This is looking at our coastline from the west towards the east, showing the sand movement. We get a partial blockage, but there is still the longshore drift where sand progresses down. But this is in effect what is actually happening. Sand now progresses upriver. And if we look at it item by item, how these deposits have grown over the years. And I was going to show you some historical pictures here. 2014 against 1955, dramatic change. You'll see a single channel where there were two channels. The interesting part too is the shape of the river. The more right angle turns, the more corners, the slower water flows and deposits its sand. Going up a little higher, Green Island, 1955 was a tiny little dot of an island. Higher up, the bridge area dramatically changed. And this is an interesting one. The little white dot in the left picture, that is the floating restaurant. Interesting that you look in the 1955 area there are no islands. And so progressively the vegetated islands are moving upriver. This shows the first 3.5 kilometers of the Bushmans estuary. And you see a very clear demarcated end of this. Beyond that, the river is 200 meters wide, quite a few meters deep, and pristine. But slowly, this sand is moving into that area as well. This I would liken to a person with cholesterol, slowly restricting the flow of liquid, and as in a human being, eventually this river will die. To build any argument, we need some facts, and facts on which we can base our arguments. Dry Bones Valley was a working bypass system for perhaps thousands of years, up to about 1990. Possibly it stopped working before that, but by 1990 it was a fait accompli. Fact number 2, we do not have a siltation problem. We have too much sand within the confined area of the lower estuary. I make this as a statement because when one speaks of siltation, one immediately imagines it coming down with floods, whereas in this case all of our siltation is of a marine sand type, and so needed to just make that point. The closure of Dry Bones Valley is not the only cause of the sand buildup, but it is the major cause. And I might say it would only be returning nature to as it was. It would be the cheapest. It is without doubt the only one that we can really do. We can't do anything about our bridges. We can't remove them, just as we can't remove any of the dams upriver. But this we can do. The encroaching dune will enter Dry Bones Valley. From the pictures you can see, I predicted this 35 years ago, and so it is without doubt happening. It will cover the properties, that is without doubt, and it will kill off substantial swaths of old coastal forest. And then some more siltation facts. More sand comes in with an incoming tide than goes out with an outgoing tide. It's an interesting fact that in the sea we have a tidal changeover of just over 6 hours, 6 hours in, 6 hours out. But by the time it comes through the estuary, it comes through the mouth, it kind of changes, and we end up with a situation where it's something like 5 hours in and 7 hours out. So the same quantity of sand comes in over a shorter period, then goes out over a longer period, so obviously more sand comes into the river, the incoming tide. There are 2 conveyors of sand into the estuary, the wind-blown sand and the marine sand. The water in the river basin is being severely reduced in volume, and the river is being slowly strangled with the possibility it could eventually close altogether. And the fact is that we're having this net gain of sand that we are measuring every year, and we are still waiting for the effect of when the vegetation is overcome on the far side, and that sand also joins with what is already happening. This will negatively affect obviously the salinity in the upper reaches of the river, and it's going to have huge effect on our fish stocks and all the marine organisms. And we're going to speak more about that in the 3rd video that we will be posting. There are 4 possible ways for man to remove sand from the estuary. There's this Dry Bones Valley that we are talking about. There's the mechanical removal of sand by loading it onto lorries and removing it. There's the possibility of dredging it at high cost. And there's the 4th one, which is tidal flooding, which is a Dennis Loebscher initiative, where the high tide would be held back with removable walls or dams and released at low tide, causing floods. And I still think that there's merit in that in the future. And then there's natural floods. It is interesting that the Bushmans River is known to have flooded quite severely in 1944 and 53, and they were the then biggest floods that were known in living memory, and we've had nothing since that. So it's quite easy to say that we have had no significant flood in 100 years that has had any real effect on our river. And from this picture we're now looking at the beach, from Middle Beach towards Central Car Park, and we see the effect of when the sand is blocked from marching in. This used to be huge big sand dunes that are slowly being eroded because there's nothing replacing the sand. You can see the landslide that is taking place right in the middle of the picture. And it's also interesting that there's hardly any sand now protecting the sea from hitting the bush line. And it is quite feasible that in this year any high sea will eventually start undermining that whole hillside, and it is feasible that within the next year or two we could see major landslides with all of the ecological effects that that will have. In 2002, Joan Muir Nature Reserve Board, of which I was chairman at the time, employed Jenny Birkinshaw to do a study on the dunes, and she predicted that the dune height would remain pretty constant until it reached the headland. The sand would enter Dry Bones Valley, and she predicted that this height would stay to about that height, and she has been 100% correct. She said that about 2014 it would possibly reach this headland, but she is in fact I think about a year short of that prediction. And she also said that once it reaches there, that the dune will rise, and this in effect is what it will look like. Visualize what actually happens. Okay, so now plan of action. Our proposal here is to remove all of the vegetation and flatten the small dunes within the valley to recreate a flat bottom sand channel. That is how it used to be historically, and we would like that to be recreated. We would mechanically move the soft sand, that white sand that we could see in the picture, the already moving natural sand, and we would load this up on lorries and distribute it over the valley floor to about 1 meter in height. And the idea is that we would keep this level to a minimum to stop sand rising to affect the houses down Dry Bones Valley, and in doing so we would also increase the wind speed, and therefore more sand would be moved. Our road ahead, we plan to engage with the property owners and local, provincial and national authorities and drive through resolutions to break the current do-nothing approach held by everyone. And obviously we need to interact with conservation bodies along our coastline to see how they are addressing similar problems. Just some history here. This is looking across Kenton towards Kwaihook. Just amazing to see that huge wide open sand beach. Also interesting to see Dry Bones Valley clear. And this is the affected area. This is the lower area of the Bushmans. To many that would never, you've never seen that, because this area now is just one big dune. Just look at all the recreation, look at the life that is taking place there. This is the last picture of the presentation, and I'd just like to close with this, that we are the present custodians of a national asset. And are we going to be able to keep it for future generations? Or are we going to, through our own selfishness or whatever, are we going to allow this to be lost?